So, welcome back to 3rd Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this time it is going to be on the hotfix, mainly because of the antics with the last battle. I feel like doing something a little bit more chilled out than a full-on siege that risks running into technical difficulties. And this is going to be on the Old Forest Road again, which usually I try to make a habit of not using the same map too quickly, or at least not reusing it not too long after I've used it last. But this time I think there is an exception because it is on the new hotfix, and I feel as though just getting a few more battles out on the hotfix before it becomes more developed and more publicly available is a good thing, just to let people know, or let people see at the very least, what's going to be happening. And it is also an RP battle, because the RP series is now running on the hotfix, so any battles that come from that I need the hotfix to do, so that's certainly something. And I also do like to do RP battles like this as soon as I'm able to when they're given to me, obviously, so they're a little bit more relevant. And today we have Numenor playing off on one side and the Orcs of the Misty Mountains playing off on the other. So two very different philosophies coming up against one another here. Quality, heavy infantry and all of that jazz from Numenor, and of course numbers, overwhelming force, and a few very decent support units as well. Is how the Misty Mountains tend to do their business. But this is also quite an interesting map, as we said before. Kind of an interesting offset. The trees don't have any snow whatsoever on them, which is kind of weird actually. It's a little bit trippy. But obviously a few hills, lots of trees as well. Obviously this map has that thing where if you zoom out in certain areas the trees disappear and they phase back in when you go forwards. Nothing I can really do about that, but hey ho. Yeah, so hills that you won't necessarily see immediately, you've got to be very careful, especially if you're the Misty Mountains actually, because this is the main hill. On the last time we saw this map, this hill was where most of the action took place. And occupying it actually wasn't the blessing it initially seemed in that battle, but here I think on a more flat 3v3, the hill is bound to be a good thing if Numenor can capitalise on it. We'll go through the Numenorian forces first of all. We'll see how much we can see actually in and amongst these trees. So Numenor have had a few changes to them. One you could say is kind of a quasi-nerf, but the other things that they've had added to them is most definitely a buff. So definitely some different things adding for Numenor. Remena Bawabrim, Death Eater here is the first Numenor player. The Remena Bawabrim are here, so obviously they're pretty much the same. Low ammunition, but very high damage, armor-piercing archers. You need to pick and choose your targets wisely. Misty Mountains is maybe not the best faction for the Bawabrim to shine, because while there are a few targets you can go after with the Bawabrim, you may not have the opportunity to pick and choose your targets if the Orcs of the Misty Mountains are quick on the draw. And the Misty Mountains are capable of absorbing casualties like no other faction really. Only Mordor can do that in the same way that they can, and so a low ammunition unit like this may not be the best thing to have, but we'll see. There are definitely targets within the Misty Mountains army that an armor-piercing archer can very much take advantage of. Just in behind them we have the classic combination, well, not a classic combination as such, but a classic phalanx, line infantry, which is where Numenor obviously really excel, the Remena Abarim, which are capable of dishing out an awful lot of damage for a unit of line infantry. Like, that's the thing with line infantry. In the hotfix, they have been made just a little bit better, I would suggest. Nothing too drastic, but infantry as a whole is something which has benefited quite a lot from the changes made in the hotfix. I'm tempted to call it 0.97.1, but it's a bit of a mouthful. But yeah, the Remena Abarim were good anyway, to be fair, and really high-end line infantry was pretty decent. It's more sort of the basic stuff that I feel as though we're going to see the fruits of the developers' labour when it comes to buffs like that. But the Abarim are obviously never going to hurt from an infantry-focused patch like this. Just in behind, Numenor Sentinels, pretty much the same thing as you'd expect. Very heavily armoured and shielded, which for a pike unit is very, very rare in this game. In fact, there is only one other genuinely shielded unit of pikes, and they're nowhere near as heavily armoured as the Numenor Sentinels, so they're going to be here in the middle of the line holding things down. Velagire Pikemen, one of the changes that has been made to them is they no longer sort of default into using the halberd animation, so that is something which is, if you don't... The halberd animation for pikes is obviously not as good, because it means when things close with them, they start trying to chop in the halberd fashion, which for a unit of pikes like this is not what you want. You want them to stay in the pokey formation, and the changes should allow the Velagire Pikemen to do that, so they'll be much more effective than they were previously. This is the unit actually where the quasi-nerf has come in for Numenor, and it's the Seafarers of Nindamos, and I actually do agree with this, because the Seafarers of Nindamos, Numenor, relying on them is maybe too strong of a word, but they shouldn't really be able to just sort of, I guess rely is the word I'm using really. They shouldn't really be able to rely on the Seafarers to do as much reliable damage as they are capable of doing in the current build. For what they cost, the Seafarers of Nindamos, even with their low ammunition count, are a little bit too strong, to be honest with you. They're capable of blowing holes in the enemy line far too easily for what they cost, and so their damage is going to be brought more into line with other units. To give this some context, they have a higher base damage in the current patch than something like the Balchos Sapphire Blazeman, which is a bodyguard javelin unit, which obviously shouldn't be the case. It should really be the other way around. They're still very high damage, they're still used for the same thing, they're just not quite as effective at range as they used to be. In the last hotfix battle, we saw the Mithlond Marines in action, and they still devastated an enemy line. That's more what you can expect the Seafarers of Nindamos to be in the upcoming patch. So it means that Numenor don't have a unit that's very cheap that they can use as a, well, relatively cheap next to the other units in their army, that they can use as a crutch so easily. They're still very effective, they're just not as overbearing on the Numenor roster as they used to be, which I do agree with. As much as I do like the Seafarers, that is something that needed to happen, I think. Remenar Dukadar, the armor-piercing spears, of course, are really a really nice unit to have. Like in general, them and the Citadel Guard are such a nice unit to have when you're Numenor or Gondor. And against armored factions, especially the Misty Mountains, their entire survivability really comes from their armor. They're going to be very, very useful, and spears can hold the line for an awfully long period of time. Nardukadar back here as well. And then finally the mighty Pharazim Swordmasters, and this, as it is the hotfix, is the version that has 3 hit points. So they're much more along the same sort of lines as what the Guards of Khazad-dûm were in the previous patch in 0.97. We'll get on to Khazad-dûm and their changes another time perhaps if I get a hotfix battle with Khazad-dûm in it, but for here just know, Pharazim Swordmasters, 3 HP, very expensive though. They cost the same as a unit of Knights, so Knights are going to be capable of dealing more devastating damage on an open field like this, so it is a trade-off you need to think about making between them and the Pharazim Nobles on horseback. But if you get them into a sort of long, prolonged fight on foot, they're going to be able to carve their way through enemies very, very nicely indeed. We'll go through the other Numenorian armies a little bit quicker because we've gone through most of the changes that Numenor can expect. Obviously relatively minor, but Numenor were already a pretty decent and complete faction anyway. Belagair archers on the front line, ready to skirmish with the enemy, of course. And against the Misty Mountains archers, the Belagair archers will have very little to really deal with. The base Belagair units, I should say, because it's not just the archers, have had their base armor increased a little bit because it was a little bit lackluster, and obviously the upgraded armor will increase that even further. So they'll be slightly better at their job now, actually, the Belagair archers. And against the Misty Mountains, though, even as they were in 0.97, they'll have no issues. It'll only be crossbows if they get into range that they'll have trouble with. Nardukadar here on the second line, obviously again, should be very useful against the Misty Mountains just because of the kind of unit that they are. And the Seafarers, again, changed in the ways that we mentioned. Boabarim on the flank, more Swordmasters. Has he got any other units? Abarim, Naruna Iron Sentinels, and Belagair Pikes. Obviously, RP means you can't pick and choose your army for each battle per se. Agalar Garludathon, by the way, is also the player who sent me the battle replay. Royal Legion of Armenelos are pretty much unchanged, to be honest with you. They were always very strong for their category of unit because they had more men in the unit, and that's still the case here. So yeah, the higher tier Numenorian units are very, very devastating in this patch, as you would expect, but of course, very expensive as well. Price changes here and there as well. The Royal Legion of Armenelos might have actually had a slight price increase, but I'm not entirely certain of that. Exfits, playing as Numenor, once again. We've got some more Nardukadar. He's actually got some Belagair footmen as well, and obviously the changes to them includes the base armor being increased a little bit. Doesn't have the armor upgrade here, but that's not too important considering they've had their base armor increased. Yeah, pretty much as close as it gets to fodder for Numenor, but they are just a mainline spear unit when you compare them to other Kingdoms of Men units, so could be useful against the Misty Mountains to hold the line, also to maybe defend the back lines against wargs, but the real devastation from Numenor's infantry will come from other sources, of course. Sentinels, pikemen, we've got some Seafarers of Nindamos back here as well, Pharazim Swordmasters. Lots of Boabarim on the field today, which, again, this is kind of what you expect from Numenor. Very high damage in a short space of time with their skirmishers. The Belagair are really the only ones that don't really follow that philosophy, and Remena Abarim over here as well. So obviously they're going to be a really useful unit against the heavy goblin hordes that they're undoubtedly going to be facing off against. Speaking of which, we have FFA Muffins, who's going to be playing as the first Misty Mountains army. It's actually quite useful when the trees disappear, to be honest with you, so I can see the front lines a little bit more. Heavy Goblin Spears, pretty much unchanged to what they were because they obviously did their job well enough. Armor-piercing, lower-end spears, so the AP is obviously going to be very useful against Numenor. Problem is the overall quality of the unit may be in question. They're really just going to be here to try and hold the front line and get as many kills as they can with their AP. It's going to be the supporting units from the Misty Mountains that are going to need to do the business here, or they can try and charge forward and overwhelm the Numenor positions, but we shall see. Heavy Goblin Halberdiers in behind them as well, again very much the same sort of thing, lower end halberds, but they're not as slow as they once were anymore, I believe it was that Kuro told me. So they should have their effectiveness increased ever so slightly, but again that's it's probably not the sort of thing you'll notice straight from the off, but it might make a little bit of a difference as the battle wears on. Goblin King's Bodyguard in here, obviously nice morale buffer. And as far as infantry goes, they're probably one of the few offerings from the Misty Mountains that will be able to overpower some of Numenor's frontline troops. Cave Troll Drummers, they've had their cost decreased, so 600 florins now for one, and you can actually bring 2 as well. I'm not sure if bringing 2 is going to be necessary in the vast majority of cases, because you'd have to have a very stretched army in order to need 2 to buff the important bits, but it's still an option for you now as the Misty Mountains, and few factions need morale buffing quite like the Misty Mountains. Heavy Goblin Spears again, White Uruk Fearmongers, which of course are going to be like the strongest phalanx unit you have available. Nice armor piercing on them as well. A little bit further back we have the Black Uruks, and the Black Uruks are going to be subject to the changes that all shock infantry have, so shock infantry is now going to be slightly cheaper across the board and slightly more effective as well, so overall it adds up to be a pretty significant difference. Very much a useful tactic to employ now, maybe to go more heavily into your shock infantry to try and do damage more quickly, as would be the idea behind bringing shock infantry of course. And the Black Uruks will be party to that as well. It's mainly something to help like the Elven and Human ones who don't have the same numbers as something like the Orc ones here, but they will still be slightly more effective than they were in 0.97 standard. Crossbows, completely unsurprising to see them. Like, I'd say the Heavy Goblin crossbows are a must-bring against factions like Numenor, whose quality so far outstrips the Misty Mountains. They're going to need to get into a good position and do the damage. They can do more damage over time than even something like the Ravenna Steel Bowmen, but obviously it's more easy to shut down unit of crossbows like this by breaking them, by just saturating them with fire, or by a single cavalry charge. Not that there is any cavalry on the field today, I don't think, because again, I think they're still sort of going through the infantry when it comes to testing the hotfix. More Black Uruks over here, and I think that's just about it, at least from what we can see. Obviously, the Misty Mountains do have a few units that can hide anyway, and we're in and amongst the trees as it is. We have Inarius, who's also playing as them. I agree with this pick. Like, the Mountain Uruk Coast are just a very efficient unit in 0.97, and the hotfix, I don't think they've changed all that much. Pretty much an analogous to the Uruk-hai infantry, so it's the Misty Mountain version of that, really. And very much going to be a useful unit against Numenor. They're obviously going to lose still against Numenor, but they won't lose quite as heavily as standard Heavy Goblins, and they're pretty high in number as well. Heavy Goblin Spears are here. To be fair though, the Heavy Goblin Infantry are more useful than they were in the previous patch, purely because they've had their price drop to 350, which more accurately reflects the kind of unit that they are and how they generally perform. We have Heavy Goblin Crossbowmen up on this hill. Cave Trolls, which of course, very good for line breaking, getting in and amongst the Numenorians, and considering how few men Numenor have in relation to the Misty Mountains, they're not really going to be able to stop the Cave Trolls from getting behind the lines if they so choose, but most of Numenor's skirmishers are also perfectly capable of taking on Cave Trolls in melee as well, so that's something to be bearing in mind. Heavy Goblin Halberdiers here as well, Heavy Goblin Crossbows, more Goblin King Bodyguard, and actually they've had their unit numbers increased by the looks of things. I believe they had a smaller unit in the last patch, so this puts them more into line with something like the Royal Legion of Armenelos. Obviously individually they're still not able to hold a candle to them, but it's still something worth mentioning. It definitely fits into the Misty Mountains philosophy as well, should make them much more effective actually at what they do. White Uruk Fearmongers, more Heavy Goblin Crossbows, there's Cave Troll Drummers in there as well. Lots of halberds, I have to say, and there's some Heavy Goblin Archers out front as well. This really is going to be a token effort at best, though, for the Misty Mountains here, because the Belagir are going to be easily able to hold them at arm's length. And to be honest with you, they won't do a lot of damage from the front against the heavily armoured Ravenna legions either. And then just a little bit further back, we have Creed, who's going to be playing. Been a while since I've seen Creed, actually, so good to see him. We've got some Heavy Goblin, at least in a replay. Got some Heavy Goblin crossbows, not Heavy Goblin crossbows on the front line. Obviously, again, crossbows very, very key for Misty Mountains in this fight. Crossbows are such a good supporting tool for an army, especially when the quality is acting against you in the way that it inevitably will in this battle here. Lots of halberds and spears, so a lot of AP being brought to bear by the Misty Mountains from their sort of lower end unit, which is useful because it means even their lower tier troops should be able to pick up some decent kills. Obviously they're not going to be able to hold a candle to Numenor in terms of quality, but it's all about getting that cost efficiency from even your lower end troops here for the Misty Mountains, because they're never going to win a quality war against Numenor. White Uruk Fearmongers on the flank. We have some Goblin Archers, so just some standard Goblin Archers. Once again, just here as a bit of a token effort, really. Cave Troll Drummers to make sure these Goblins don't rout in the face of the scary Numenorians. Goblin Archers back here, and I think that's pretty much all we can see. He's actually gone for the 2 Cave Troll Drummers as well, so that's interesting. We'll be able to see how effective that is. I mean, it's going to be able to cover his whole line, which is fairly long, to be fair. We'll see if that's going to be enough to keep them in melee with the Numenorians. So he's a little bit further back, so it'll take him a little longer to engage with the enemies. Almost certainly got a couple of hidden units back here as well. I think... Is this his bodyguard? Yeah, the Goblin Archers are his general's bodyguard unit, so he may have a hidden unit of Goblin King bodyguard, maybe some Blackback Berserkers here and there. Definitely a unit I'd bring against Numenor because of their high damage. One of the few units you can count on having that amount of damage against as well. But yeah, without further ado, let's begin. Very different makeup to this battle than it was on the last time we saw this battle. Last time everyone converged around this hill. It may still work out like that. If Numenor get pushed back on the other sides against Misty Mountains, they could still fall back onto this hill. They're much more likely to be able to do that after all. And honestly, if I were FFA Muffins, I would bide my time. Because the map gen is not... Well, it's not a generated map, but you get what I mean. The map is not on your side here. Numenor are going to be able to claim this hill. They're going to be able to get their really solid Remena Bawabrim and Seafarers onto the hill. It's going to be a massacre for you if you move forward. Even with the amount of troops you have at your disposal, you're not going to be able to weather that storm when you factor in the fact that Numenor's infantry is going to be so dominant. What I would do, if I were the Misty Mountains, at least trying to coordinate the Misty Mountains team, is I would say the other two armies go forwards. And then, if Engsfit starts to send across support, if Numenor starts to lose ground, that's when FFA Muffins moves in. Because I do think the Misty Mountains need to be aggressive here. I think if they allow Numenor to dictate the pace of the fight, that's going to be a problem for them. Because at long range, with their archers, Numenor's archers selection is relatively limited, and it's very much tilted towards dealing a lot of damage quickly when you focus on their more expensive units. But at long range, their archers are undoubtedly stronger than the Misty Mountains. Misty Mountains archers and Angmar archers both are very low quality, generally speaking. Heavy Goblin archers are here. The only thing they really have on their side is numbers. They've got a little bit higher armor values than the standard Goblin archers, but it's honestly not that much. Like, it looks more impressive than it is, this armor, and it already looks pretty banged up and rusted. So it does give you a bit of an idea about what that is. Interestingly enough, this Numenor army over here, ooh, that's some gnarly looking grass. Regardless, Death Eater is moving forward very aggressively here, which is interesting. I actually think this is not a bad... Well, I say that. I mean, I'm not sure whether he saw these heavy goblin crossbowmen in the trees over here. If he did, then he should never have come forward, I don't think, because now he's getting involved in a skirmish fight with crossbows with his Remena Bawabrim. This could still work out, but he definitely needs to get his troops moving quickly and sort of trying to get into the faces of this Misty Mountains force. A lot of big phalanx here, though, from the Misty Mountains, and this is going to definitely be the first. I mean, it is interesting to me that Numenor are being aggressive. That is definitely where they're most comfortable, but it's in a very different way to the Misty Mountains. And yeah, the Numenorians, they need to be very careful here, because if they move forward and be aggressive and they don't set up their battle lines well once they get close to the Misty Mountains, then they run the risk of being overwhelmed and playing into the Misty Mountains' hands. But if they do manage to set up their lines correctly and don't allow the Misty Mountains to spill over the sides, it's going to be very difficult for the Misty Mountains, because then they're going to be locked into an engagement against troops that are just higher quality than them. And this is interesting as well. So Engsfit's not using the hill, really. He's going to go forwards and he's going to get right up into the faces here of the Misty Mountains. Mech. And obviously this is the RP, actually, so that may be why we're seeing all of this. There is an Arius there as well, mind you. Heavy Goblin Halberdiers. This is interesting, though. Muffins, he definitely needs to set up his lines quickly. He also runs the risk of being shot in the back by those Balagai archers, to be honest, but I assume they're going to have their hands full dealing with the heavy Goblin archers that are firing at them. They barely brushed against the Misty Mountains line there. Balagai footmen, they're actually shaken already as well, but that's because they're a little bit further away from the support. Narina Aru Sentinels are here, and this is the thing, you do need to make sure that your aggression is well organised. You can see going right around the flank over here, the Remena Abarim and the Seafarer, so this is actually where Numenor's strength really lies. The line infantry are going to try and collapse in and along the flank over here, do some damage. Heavy Goblin crossbows already taking damage as well from afar, but they're also returning fire, so it's going to be interesting here. With all the trees and all the missiles flying back and forth, it's going to be quite difficult to see who's getting the better end of this engagement, actually. It'll only really become apparent when one side starts to fall apart, because that's the sign that their supporting units have been able to get into position much better than the other sides. Meanwhile, over here, this looks a little bit scrappy to me from Numenor. It could still work out. I mean, they are quite condensed here, which means their strength is staying largely together. The Snow Trolls have come forward, and the Snow Trolls, actually, they're a unit which can now hide anywhere, which gives them their own little thing, because they were always fast, but that never seemed like as much of an as much of a unique feature for them in comparison to how strong the other heavy trolls were in melee. and they didn't have the same ability as the cave trolls to break lines either. So the fact that they can now be used on an open field as an ambush unit is scary, and Creed has actually managed to use that to his advantage. Numenor not seeing them, getting in here. The Boabrim are posted up on this hill, shooting into the Misty Mountains line, and Creed is having none of that. He's getting in there with his trolls, and they're going to be able to do some decent damage to the Boabrim if they don't get any sort of support. But on the front line, White Uruk Fearmongers with some trolls who were stragglers and left behind, holding the Remen Nar Dukadar at arm's length, actually. And they're shaken because they don't have any support over here either. And they're also taking... well, that's actually arrow fire from Numenor trying to help them out. But a very nice defensive line here. And again, these troops are of lower quality, but it's the support here from the Misty Mountains. They're using the javelins, they're using the crossbows in behind. Numenor's supporting units are getting shot up, they're getting interrupted by the trolls. And this front line will hold for the time being. But if the support dries up, then the Misty Mountains will be in trouble. Because you can already see over here the heavy goblin spears, they've gotten a little bit further away from their support from the halberds, and they're getting ripped to pieces now. And it is a very long front line that Creed is having to try and look after here, so it's definitely not the easiest task. Remen Nar Dukadar, and to be fair, on the flanks he is losing as well, Death Eater. But he does also have the support of the Pharazim Swordmasters. We can see the Mountain Orc Berserkers are over here. Pharazim Swordmasters, of course, are lock morale, so they're not going to run away, but yeah. Mountain Orc Berserkers, AP, but the 3 hit points of the Pharazim Swordmasters, unless these are crossbow bolts and javelin volleys coming in to help the Mountain Orc Berserkers, they don't stand a chance. Remen Nar Dukadar coming across. Inarius is actually sending over support, which is bold because he may need these men in the centre, but Mountain Uruk host coming across. Perhaps they sense that they could try and maybe collapse Death Eater's army in a big way, and maybe try and win that battle efficiently. But I have to say, Agalar's army over here in the middle, again, this feels like a bit of a scrappy advance, to be honest with you. All of the Misty Mountains phalanx, well, I mean over here in the middle, have Goblin infantry with heavy Goblin halberds. It's not the scariest phalanx in the world, but it will hold Numenor in place for long enough for Inarius to react. He does need to as well. I think maybe the Goblin King's bodyguard maybe needs to come in here to defend this soft centre to his line. But again, Numenor is sort of condensing their forces into individual places and trying to smash through thin sections of the line. Hasn't really worked out for them so far, interestingly enough. Blackback Berserkers revealing themselves. They're going to get into the Seafarers. In spite of the fact they've had their damage, well, the intention is to have their damage reduced anyway. They're still very, very damaging as far as javelins go. And they're going to be able to get a volley off here into the Blackback Berserkers. And that's going to be a good amount of damage there. They don't want to be in melee with the Blackbacks for too long though, because obviously that is a fight that they are not going to win at all. Agalar's Seafarers trying to do some business as well. Royal Legion of Armenelos running forward to try and help out against FFA Muffins. Kind of difficult to see the battle lines here in and amongst the trees, but again, mixed fortunes. In some places, the Misty Mountains lines are doing very, very well at holding back, especially where it's them up against just Belagai units, kind of as you would expect. But elsewhere, I can't help but feel as though Muffins' army is really struggling. Like out here on the side, like this is a mob-like group of the Black Uruks of the mountains, and they're sort of getting surrounded by Belagai and Seafarers. Like, to be fair, these Numenorian troops are shaken, and in behind enemy lines as well are these Blackback Mountain Berserkers once again. So they were skulking around in the trees, and they're now getting in and amongst the Remena Abarim. So actually, looking at this, with all of the ambush troops that the Misty Mountains had over here, preventing this flanking move from Engsfits, the Boabrim are going to try and lay down some support, but it's a very messy fight, and generally speaking, a messy fight would normally favour the Orcs. The only reason I was maybe a little bit sceptical about that assessment is because the Orcs seem to be relying on a very organised phalanx to defend their front line, but I have to say, they've done a pretty good job, even when the fight has gotten messy here, of keeping them in place. The problem the Misty Mountains may have is that Numenor's quality could shine through eventually, and as soon as the Goblin front line starts to fall apart, that may be, you know, it's very hard to stop those dominoes falling once the first one is gone. Over here you can see that some of the Numenorians have managed to battle through the line, and again the soft centre over here, Remen Nar Dukadar and Goblin infantry not enough, but the reinforcements are now coming in, the reserves, Goblin King bodyguard and White Uruk Fearmongers are now moving in, which will stop the Nar Dukadar dead in their tracks. Still trying to shoot, even though they're getting stabbed by spears. You've got to give them credit for their commitment to the cause, I suppose. Meanwhile, these Goblin infantry getting, again, skewered by Remen Nar Dukadar. Their AP won't be too useful here, but once again, not exactly all that important when you consider the discrepancy between the two units. Reinforcements coming in though. A full unit of heavy goblin halberdiers with their phalanx, which could be a bit of a problem here for the Romena. Again, it's all about efficiency from the Misty Mountains point of view. If it just came down to KD, kill-death ratio, of course the Misty Mountains are going to lose to Numenor. But the winner of the battle isn't the one with the best KD. It's the one to destroy the opponent's army entirely. And the Mountain Orc Berserkers here defeat is a distinct possibility. They've chased a long way back into enemy lines, to be fair, and they're getting shot at point blank. But I don't think the Misty Mountains will mind too much that Bawabarim are having to use their ammunition on Mountain Orc Berserkers, to be honest. The support coming in from the side here, the Mountain Orc Coast. I do think this side of the battlefield is where the Misty Mountains are doing the best. And that's saying something, actually, because FFA Muffins, it could still go either way there because of how messy the fight is. But the support coming in from the Misty Mountains here was pretty key. I mean, Numenor is still alive and fighting. Death Eater doing his thing. But I don't think that's going to last too much longer. I think the hidden units here, the Snow Trolls, the Mountain Orc Berserkers, and the Blackback Berserkers coming around the sides with their big AP damage. Numenor weren't ready for that. Numenor came forward confident, as you would with Numenor. You know, the quality discrepancy is enormous. But I feel as though that confidence has backfired a little bit. I think they've gone forward a little bit too gung-ho. Let's go back up to 1 speed here. Yeah, and you can see here, front line, Misty Mountains still just about hanging on, but it's going to be reinforcements coming from elsewhere, which will save the Misty Mountains here. A nice rear charge coming in as well from the Mountain Orc Berserkers. In come the Snow Trolls, and again, would this have been any different with cavalry from both sides? I don't think it would, because I think both sides, their cavalry tilts more towards being anti-cav than anti-infantry. And you could say arguably the wargs with their higher damage focus would probably be better suited for taking on the Numenorian mounted riders. Numenor are probably slightly better against infantry, which could have made a difference when we start to see cavalry in the hotfix, but I'm not too convinced here. Numenor, this is a place where they've done quite well though. They've managed to punch right through. The problem is, the longer they stay here, the more damage they're going to take at the hands of archers and crossbows that are still in behind the lines. Meanwhile, Cave Trolls over here, Numenor making a bit of ground over here. In between the armies is where Numenor seem to have done the best, to be honest with you. But where the main Misty Mountains lines have been, I think the Goblins so far have had the better battle. Trolls against pikes, usually that goes in favour of the pikes, and so it has proved to be here, with a charge coming in from the heavy goblin infantry. Cave Trolls in here as well. So heavy goblin infantry, now only 350 florins, a real bargain at that price. Well, not a bargain, exactly what they're worth, to be honest with you. Very low cost for a low quality unit. Meanwhile, Goblin King's Bodyguard is in here. Numenor are trying to push in. I mean, there is routing going on for the Misty Mountains, which is always what you want to see when you're playing against them, because when you start to see routing, that effect tends to get more and more. And you can see here as well, now the Misty Mountains are starting to run out of steam. The initial engagement was pretty good, but I think eventually the chaos is starting to favour Numenor, because individual battles are going to go the way of Numenor with their additional quality. And I feel as though this is one of those rare occasions where organisation probably would have actually assisted the Orcs. At least because the Misty Mountains initially held their ground and were a little bit more defensive. If the Misty Mountains had gone forward, that may have been a little bit different, but also the upshot of that is they wouldn't have been able to spring their ambushes. In come the Seafarers now. Goblin King Bodyguard are still fighting back here. There's an officer there. Looks like a Royal Legionnaire, but it's not. Pharazim Swordmasters are going to be so dominant against low-tier goblins like this. Like, they're barely going to land a scratch on them, and they're going to rip through unit after unit. This is one thing, though. Javelins and crossbows, even if Inarius and FFA Muffins end up losing this flank, they can make Numenor pay for it with javelins and crossbows that are sort of straggling behind. Belagaya Pikemen moonwalking into melee. The ultimate flex on your opponent when you start moonwalking into the fight. What have we got going on here? Snow Trolls polishing off things over here. So I think this is going to be the story of this battle. I think the Misty Mountains are going to win on this side. Numenor are probably going to win on the other. But the problem is the Misty Mountains, in spite of the fact they've won over on this side, they have taken losses. Like, high quality factions like this are always going to go down fighting. They're always going to take their toll. There goes the general, and I think that is FFA Muffins is on the other side. But like I said, it's going to take quite a lot to bring the Pharazim Swordmasters down, even with only 28 of them. They will go down, of course, but they will take their fair share before they do. So I'm actually going to go out on a limb and favour Numenor in this fight, because I feel as though the quality is what's going to see them over the line. They're still Blackback Berserkers, but in the late game, when Numenor, when it's like relatively even in terms of numbers, the quality is going to be important. I mean, there are still phalanx units like Heavy Goblin Halberds. It wouldn't be the first time I've seen a single unit of Halberd or Pike Infantry manage to pull out the victory. But I mean, when it comes to phalanx units, the heavy goblin halberds are one of the cheapest around, and you do get what you pay for in this sort of situation, especially if they come up against Naru and Aru sentinels. But yeah, it's looking pretty good for Numenor over here. Again, very depleted to be fair, but victorious. I think they're going to try and chase down the... Yeah, they are going to try and chase down. You can see here, big routing. Snaga skirmishers were caught. They're going to try and run away with the heavy goblin crossbows. If they can somehow save them, then that will be a big save, because they still have ammunition, and those crossbow bolts could be absolutely critical into the late game when you're talking about overcoming a quality discrepancy. 37 Royal Legion of Armanelos as well. Like, in the late game, I think elite units that are surviving start to become more and more important because of the lower numbers on the field. Initially, you can try and deal with elite units by mobbing them with a bunch of other units, but as the fight goes on, when I start to see Pharazim Swordmasters that have only lost 2 or 3 units in the unit models in the unit, you start to think, yeah, that's going to be very significant as the fight goes on. Cave Troll Drummers now being overwhelmed. Agalar's forces have overcome Inarius' in the middle quite comprehensively, actually. And like I said, Inarius, he did siphon off a few units to help Creed. And, oof, I mean, putting faith in your sort of ability to just hold the line. Because if you do that, then you're probably thinking, alright, well, we'll try and just hold here and win on the flanks. But you're taking your life into your hands if you do that when you're the Misty Mountains and you're facing off against Numenor's quality, because you're only going to last for so long if you're the Misty Mountains on this front line. Even with the morale buffing of the Cave Troll Drummers, even with the support of stuff like White Uruk Fearmongers and Goblin King Bodyguard, you're going to struggle, and this is a lot of Nardukadar to try and deal with. The crossbows are going to need to do overtime here in order to try and bring this back. Snaga Skirmishers being engaged in melee now by Agalar's Pharazim Swordmasters, who have taken a little bit more damage, but the Snaga Skirmishers they're going to try and wriggle away. I thought they were routing them, but it won't take much more to rout them, surely. Naru Aru Sentinels. Belagir Pikemen moving in. Yeah, I don't think the Misty Mountains have got the quality. It was looking pretty good for the Misty Mountains actually earlier on in the fight, but on the flanks, I think it was over there with FFA Muffins and Inarius over there. Like, Inarius sent over troops to help Creed. I don't know, I think he sent over some stuff to help FFA Muffins as well, but the Misty Mountains won one side, Numenor won the middle and won the other side, and obviously those numbers don't add up for the Misty Mountains. You need to have far superior numbers in the late game when you're going up against a faction like Numenor if you're the Orcs, and the Misty Mountains manpower has deserted them a little bit here. I did like, to be fair, the ambushes from the Misty Mountains. I feel as though maybe they just lent in a little bit too heavily on that. I would also say that Creed's also worked out far better than FFA Muffins because of the way that Engsvitz approached the situation. He was already going out wide with his units. He wasn't expecting that ambush, I don't think. But he still had units over there to respond to the situation, which prevented it from spiralling out of control like it did slightly for Death Eater. Blackback Mountain Berserkers now getting pinned in between line infantry and Naru and Aru Sentinels. That's not going to be good news for them. And yeah, like, the problem with the Blackback Berserkers is very high damage, but obviously not going to be able to withstand the kind of punishment that's going to be sent their way this time. Heavy Goblin Spears starting to rout all over the place. Snaga Skirmishers throwing their jabbies in. Pharazim Swordmasters taking a little bit more damage as they make their way through this hostile section of the battlefield, but this is a very dangerous unit for Numenor now. If you see the Pharazim Swordmasters, you need to have a plan in place to deal with them, because they're a small unit like any bodyguard unit is, but 3 hit points, as we've seen with what the original .97's Guards of Khazad-dûm were like, it's just that extra level, man. Like, extra hit point is difficult to shave off. But we shall see how that develops when the hotfix is released, what people think of it. Mountain Orc Berserkers are here, getting overwhelmed through sheer numbers. Belagir archers pulling out their short swords, using their bucklers in melee to try and block those very large axes. Unenviable task, to be sure. Blackback Berserkers with their hooked swords, very barbaric looking weapons, more like a war pick than a sword really. There's still a lot of goblins just sort of running all over the place in the trees, but a lot of them are routing, which is not a good sign for the Misty Mountains. It's never what you want to see if you're playing as the lowly goblins. Over here as well, a strong point of infantry, these White Fearmongers being exposed, surrounded by Nardukadar, Royal Legion of Armanelos coming in here with their brass armour as well. In come some seafarers as well to offer a bit of support. Overwhelming force at this point. It's really just trying to scour the woods. I mean, to be fair, the Misty Mountains could have a whole army back here and I probably wouldn't even notice it. Heavy Goblin Halberds returning from routing. Let's see here. Romana Bawabaran coming in here to try and help finish off the Blackback Berserkers, who they aren't going to go down without a fight, as you would expect. But go down they will. This is a very linear fight down here, which is what Inarius was hoping for, I'm sure, but in the end I do think he may be... Oh, hello. They did manage to save a couple of units over here. Crossbows that... Well, a couple of units. There's 5 Blackback Berserkers and Heavy Goblin Crossbowmen over here as well, but... No, 100 Heavy Goblin Crossbows. Decent amount of stopping power in there. But... I mean, it's not going to be enough really, is it? Like, look at the chaos which has erupted now. There's really no battle lines at this point. Snaga are routing, Bawabarim are pursuing, Seafarers are here. They're just trying to make sure none of these units return, I think. Because obviously in an RP, you need to make sure that you win as efficiently as possible. This has been a very bloody battle, this, but in the end, quality did manage to overcome quantity on this occasion. And the Blackbacks now being overwhelmed. So a short and sweet battle this, relative to what is normally shown, but I feel as though that was what was needed after the antics of the last battle replay. And also it's on the hotfix, so I get to talk about some of the new stuff that's coming, which is nice. Dead trolls in the snow. How sad. Heavy Goblin Crossbows. I think this is pretty much the only thing the Misty Mountains have left now, right? I mean, they can try and get the odd kill here and there, try and wear down Numenor's manpower a little bit more. And they can succeed in that, but only with a couple more volleys, and ultimately, of course, they will be hunted down and dealt with. Oh, England just beat Ireland in the Six Nations. You can date this video, or the recording of this video from that, if you care to. Happy days. Bawabarim. Moving forwards. Those Snaga, they might return from routing, to be fair, which would be annoying for Numenor to have to deal with, but I mean, here we can see Nardukadar. Seafarers of Nindamos coming in. This will prevent them from firing. Well, I suppose they could try and hold their ground and fire, but they're not going to last very long in melee, of course. Heavy Goblin Crossbows never do. More troops following in from behind as well, so yeah. And these are good players as well, like obviously all of the players on display today here, plenty of experience with the game, as anyone playing on the hotfix probably will, because obviously it's a testing process, so it's not open for general release just yet, but yeah, I feel as though Numenor's quality here was just too much, and you, as the Misty Mountains, if you're going to play in this way, if you're going to try and be a little bit more defensive perhaps, in this situation against Numenor, because Numenor love to be aggressive, if they can close the distance, start using their javelins, start really getting up close and personal with their scary heavy infantry, and you don't have a plan to deal with that, then you're going to be in trouble. I think the Misty Mountains' plan was to win the flanks with a combination of Inarius sending over reinforcements to both sides from the middle, and just leaving enough of a force to hold Aguilar's army in place for long enough, as well as an ambush from the sides from Creed and FFA Muffins. It kind of worked. It worked on Creed's side, to be fair, but it didn't work enough to justify giving up the centre, I don't think. And that's the thing. Mounted units could have made a big difference, one way or the other. Dolg's Champions are a very significant unit after all. But hindsight is 2020, and of course in an RP you just have to make do with the armies that you've got, and these Misty Mountains armies are pretty good all-purpose, just sort of general use armies, I would say. Nice to hold the line, enough supporting units to be able to deal damage, and to be fair, they're still dealing damage. Still doing a good amount of damage to units like Royal Legion. They're not going to last much longer like this, though. Snaga did return. Look at all those units running around in the background, chasing the goblins from the field, along the forest road. This kind of forest, I feel like this is the kind of place where goblins and Snaga skulking around would be quite at home, to be honest with you. I know that the idea is that they're more at home in sort of like tunnels like Moria, but if this place had a darker atmosphere, it would feel pretty apt for the goblins. Heavy Goblin Crossbows running away. Are these Snaga the last unit standing on the field for the Misty Mountains? They could very well be. Nope, they're not, because they're routing and the battle isn't quite over. Must be something over here then, surely. Yes, it is. It's another unit of Snaga. So they're still here. Any kills they get in melee will frankly be a miracle. But Numenor victorious. They've been victorious in this battle for a little while, since about the 10k frame mark, to be honest with you. But it was looking pretty dicey for a little while there. But ultimately Numenor was able to adapt to the situation and make it so they didn't fall apart, which is good. And their quality certainly did help them as well when things got up close and personal, and the Misty Mountains just weren't quite able to win their engagements efficiently enough. And again, I feel as though part of that is just down to a couple of things, like the army compositions. I feel as though if you were the Misty Mountains going up against Numenor, you have the crossbows, you have the javelins. Under normal circumstances, I think you'd probably go for some mounted units as well. But it is a pretty tricky matchup for the Misty Mountains, to be fair. I do think the hidden units were a good idea, though. I feel as though the macro tactics maybe were a little bit questionable. Just because Inarius lost in the middle, because he siphoned off a lot of his resources. If you're going to do that, you need to be damn sure that you're going to win on both flanks, and they won narrowly on Creed's flank, but they lost on the other one. And obviously then you've also surrendered the middle. It's going to be tough, especially against a faction which is so comfortable when they're on the front foot like Numenor. If it was a faction that you don't necessarily associate with aggression all that much, for example Dale, who are a little bit more happy when things are on an elongated skirmish, this could have worked. But ultimately, it's surrendering the initiative to a faction like Numenor or Imladris is going to be a very, very dangerous thing, even if you feel as though you've got the numbers to overcome a lot of casualties. So, let's have a little look at what did the damage for Numenor. Pharazim Swordmasters, of course, I imagine they're going to have done very well. This unit of Belagar Pikes, over 300 kills, nearly 400 as well, so very, very dominant from them. The other unit only got 42, so I'd imagine their phalanx was busted, which is... It sort of is an interesting sort of insight into how different the differential between how pikes can sort of perform. This would have been an ideal situation for them against lower tier goblin troops, very happily poking and prodding away at them for a long period of time. This, they were probably either stomped by trolls, or they were hit by javelins or crossbows, or they were just forced into an up close and personal melee fight with blackback berserkers. Further down, over 200 kills on the Seafarer, so they're still very capable of doing a lot of damage at range, but also I'd say in melee they were probably fairly comfortable here, because against a lot of the goblins the Seafarer is going to be well able to do some good damage as well, more so than even the Abarim. But Engsvitz also, his Abarim sort of ran headfirst into that ambush. They were able to stabilise, of course, but as a result they never got as many kills as they maybe could have. Agalar, Nara and Iron Sentinels, again, the pikes were really dominant here, which doesn't surprise me too much, because the Misty Mountains, of course, don't have any pikes of their own. All of their phalanx units are halberds, so if they do get involved in sort of a ground war against pikes, it can be really devastating for them, especially against really high quality pikes like the Nara and Aru Sentinels. Swordmasters did very well. The Royal Legion actually did slightly better in this situation. A lot of units getting over 200 kills. So against the Misty Mountains, you're obviously going to be able to pad your KD quite a bit because of all the heavy goblins that are running around. But yeah, all of the heavy infantry here for him performed very well. But also he was allowed to by Inarius. Not saying Inarius played poorly, it was just the decision. If you're going to do that, you need to be sure you're going to win on both flanks, because in the middle you're always going to lose that fight, and there's nothing Inarius could have done to change that really, based on the fact he decided to go and help his allies. But again, not really something he did wrong per se. It's just something that I don't think they had maybe the composition for. Down here, over 200 kills on this was Death Eater's army. So Death Eater probably had the roughest time of Numenor, because his was the flank where Numenor ultimately lost. But I do feel as though Inarius' support coming in from the other side, Creed's ambush over on this side was very well executed as well, getting into his supporting units of Bawabarim and the like. So yeah, difficult for him, but still several units breaking 200 kills, more breaking 100 as well. So even in a losing situation, a lot of kills indeed for Death Eater. So yeah, a good battle. Big thank you to Agalar Galudathon for sending this one to me. Nice to see the hotfix, obviously nice to see some of the changes as well. Nothing too immediately apparent, especially when it comes to these two factions. Obviously nothing in the way of new units for these two. I don't think there's really any new units at all, to be honest with you. There's just sort of changes to unit models, and some units have been made a lot more useful, such as the Iron Watch of Miramir from Khazad-dûm. Khazad-dûm have got quite a bit to talk about actually, which if we see Khazad-dûm before release, that would be interesting to speak of, although I am going to do a video about a week before release, sort of a more general overview, just sort of going through each faction, sort of talking through some of the things that have changed on each one, of course, like I said. But yeah, for here, Numenor showing their quality against the Misty Mountains. Again, it barely gets a bigger discrepancy than this. Misty Mountains, certainly the most quantity-focused faction in the game. Numenor, they may, you know, I think Imladris certainly would be more quality-focused than Numenor. But I mean, it's pretty close. Like Numenor, Khazad-dûm, Imladris, those are the three factions I think of when I think of good, like really high-quality heavy infantry. And so it proved to be here. Their units really did very, very well. So yeah, big thank you to Agalar for sending this one in. Big thank you to all the players for being a part of this battle, and big thank you to the RP for continuing to provide these sort of faction versus faction replays, which I always find quite enjoyable because it allows you to see the strengths and weaknesses as a whole, rather than when you have like all different factions and all the strengths and weaknesses blur together and it's kind of difficult to sort of pin them down. But here I think that was very obvious with the quality-quantity split. But yeah, looking forward to the hotfix. Next, I'm not sure. I think next I was actually given another siege battle by Sin, so hopefully this one doesn't run into the same technical issues that the last one did. But this one is on an updated version of the Cardland Outpost, which I'm actually very intrigued to see. Hopefully there's not a single choke point again where you can just surround it with rangers and kill my frames. But again, I live in hope. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.